Welcome to the presentation. We're going to go over overcoming Lyme disease. I'm going to start this off by talking about this. We recently did a consultation with somebody who's had Lyme disease for well over a decade, seeing a multitude of people, and her point of being extremely dysfunctional. They can only be up a couple hours a day, have to go lay down, rest for a while. They've been doing everything they can, have no energy, really can't function at all. We have people fill out quite a bit of information to do a consultation, and doing the consultation, we've found a whole bunch of things that are going on that are adding up to where this person was at. And just in the consultation, we start talking about some changes that needed to be done. They asked for some clarification. They're coming home from shopping, actually, when we did the consultation. And they went back to the store, picked up a bunch of things that we had talked about, started implementing those into their diet. In a matter of 1 or 2 days, they're already having significant changes and able to be up and about more. They hadn't been able to drive for quite some time, and they're able to drive, function more, be up more, have more energy, more mental clarity. And this is without even doing an evaluation. This is pretty typical of what happens in one of our consultations. So we obviously must be doing something different than what most people are really used to. So we're going to get into some of the predisposing factors of why people are too weak to overcome Lyme disease in the first place. In reality, if our immune system was working right, we should never be able to get sick. Something's beat it up to do that. Malnutrition is one of the key things that actually brings that about. There's 2 different kinds of malnutrition. There's a typical classic protein calorie malnutrition that you see in starved children with distorted bellies and just pencil thin arms and legs. That's one type. The other type is something that's a new thing coming more out of the developed countries, and that's empty calorie overfeeding. The food engineers, especially in America, have so manipulated the food that they produce that they make things that have no nutrients in them, a fair amount of calories, no nutrients, and they make the flavors so they're addictive, and it makes people addicted to this empty calorie overfeeding where they get obese, their organ system shut down, all of their functions start to shut down, and it really sets them up for something like Lyme disease to really come in. Another factor is environmental toxins, which is really a huge issue with the present health crisis going on. We've seen a huge upsurgence of environmental toxins, and those beat up the immune system. They beat up most of the organ systems within the body, the hormonal glands, the gut, the immune system, and with that it makes us weak, so that it doesn't take a lot for diseases like Lyme disease to come in and take hold and really start to wreak havoc. Third one has to do with gut function dysbiosis, which is also the biggest, or one of the biggest complications that comes along with this. We'll get into that one a little bit later. So we started looking at why people don't get well, and it's really an eye-opening thing. This is out of an article out of Business Week. They were quoting a research article out of New England Journal of Medicine. And it shows that only 20 to 25% of what doctors are doing is actually effective. And the reality is, this study has to do with medical doctors, but it's pretty much the case with all the professions. Most doctors know that they're only going to be able to help 20 to 25% of the people that come in to see them, and that helping only encompasses Well, it encompasses three things. That means they can help slow something down so somebody's doing better. They can stop it, which is less likely. And the final stage of helping would be to reverse something, which is the rarest of all of them. So the bulk of the helping is just slowing things down, being more passive. There's very little of actually restoring health that goes on. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One of the reasons is, this is an article out of the Journal of American Medical Association talking about their education. It hasn't changed since 1910. So they haven't really changed the approach or the function of medical education for over 100 years. And some of the other professions, actually, it appears to be in a lot of the professions, the quality of education has really gone downhill since I went through the institutions. And what's happening is there's this huge upsurgence of chronic illness, but they don't teach that in any of the higher educational colleges. So it doesn't really matter whether you're talking medical or alternative. They don't teach what chronic illness is and how to address it. They teach acute illness, and they don't function the same. They don't progress the same. And what's going on with them isn't the same. So you can't treat them the same. You can't extrapolate what you've learned about acute disease into chronic disease, because it just doesn't work. Here's another one that's really eye-opening. The third largest cause of death in the United States is medical error. The other professions don't have to deal with the same critical issues, so we need to be honest as far as that goes. But people don't realize how ineffective and dangerous the care is that they're seeking is. The British Journal of Medicine looked at the statistics printed in the American medical journals, and they looked at the statistics and said, you guys did this wrong. This is over twice of what you guys have published. This is a much bigger factor than what you are recognizing. And some of the sources actually say that this is typically over 550,000, depends on what that is. So it's right up there with heart disease and cancer, pretty much in the same ballpark. Then another factor that really determines a large reason why people don't get well is a lot of the research articles are actually falsified. Even in the best scientific peer-reviewed journals out there, the outcomes are actually not supported by the research that were done. Somebody gets paid off, they print something else because money drives pretty much everything, and the corruption is pretty steep. They have done research to find out why the research does not support the conclusions. 75% of that time, at least, is because of overt fraud. Here's another one that is a real eye-opening one. People are flocking to go get their lab test done so that they can find out what's going on. They don't realize the inaccuracy of the lab test. In Lyme disease, the Western blot, with children at least, it's right close to 70% inaccurate. Most people don't really realize this about the Western blot. It used to be published in the lab websites that it was only accurate the first 6 to 8 weeks of infection. After that, it had no clinical accuracy. The ELISA tests, they have 1 to 2 weeks of accuracy. And virtually all of the lab tests for Lyme disease, co-infections, and all that are all the ELISA form. People don't realize those only have an accuracy of 0 to 20% in the first 1 to 2 weeks of infection. IGeneX has come out with a new test testing way more strains of Borrelia bacteria that causes Lyme disease recently, but there's no indication that there's an increase in accuracy that comes out of that. Tom Greer, one of the foremost researchers in Lyme disease, cites a study where they took triple blood draws from a bunch of people that they knew had Lyme disease. They carefully labeled those samples of blood and sent them off to the best Lyme labs in the world. Sometimes all three samples would go to the same lab. Sometimes one sample would go to 3 different labs. Out of the 516 blood samples they took doing triple blood draws, no 2 lab results were the same. Whether those went to 3 different labs measuring with their protocols or the same lab measuring the same protocol, no 2 results were the same. Tom Greer called that an outrage and said the test should be outlawed. And the ELISA accuracy is known to be, they say 45%, but it's considerably less than that. So if we look at IGeneX's own website, this is one of the quotes off of their website, is that their test results are not a diagnosis. So the people are going there spending it, for a good Lyme workup, you're going to spend at least $3,000 to get the whole thing, and it's not diagnostic. It's really an important thing to know. Also, whenever somebody does labs, the labs, they're looking for a diagnosis. The labs are they usually establish a diagnosis off of labs. They can't, it should be confirming, but usually establish it. Whenever somebody gets a lab result diagnostic picture, then they look up a protocol in the medical institution. That's Merck manual. In other professions, it's just people who travel around doing seminar circuits, and they give their latest, greatest idea on what you should do to treat people, and they have people use that. And it's basically a guess, and it's not clinically effective enough to really do what needs to happen in an individual, because that's really a lot different. By the way, in our typical evaluations, every one that we do, there's over $9,000 worth of lab tests done. We do all our own lab testing, all our own work in office. If you're going to go anywhere else, it costs you $9,000 just for the lab tests. And typically, we can get people healthy for less than what they would charge for lab tests somewhere else. And that $9,000 in their approach gives nothing on analyzing and doing evaluations and treatment. None of it goes to that. So Center for Disease Control puts this quote out about Rickettsia testing. Greatest challenge is it's really difficult to get a diagnostic test out of this early on, and the reason why is because they're just so inaccurate, and that's when their therapies they think would be the most effective. We'll find out that that's not necessarily the case. So the lab test typically is a traditional approach, and we'll compare that to a functional approach just so you understand the difference in how you go about addressing this, and that difference really is going to determine what your outcome is going to be. With a traditional approach, everything is compartmentalized, and you may have 100 different symptoms, but they're looked at as isolated issues. You compare that to a functional approach, they look at the whole body, and they try and see how everything ties together, and it always does. There's no such thing as an isolated incident in the way that our bodies work. Everything interacts with something else. The traditional approach typically use lab tests to try and find some hard type of a diagnostic picture. In a functional approach, you assess the function of every organ system in the body with all its different organ functions, and it's a way different approach, but it makes a lot more sense. In the traditional approach, it's bug oriented. In the functional approach, it's response-oriented. In other words, with a traditional sense, you're doing testing to try and find out what bug is causing everything. In a functional approach, you're finding out how the body responds to different bugs, toxins, dysfunctions, detox pathways, things along that line. Traditional approach, the function is extrapolated off the acute disease model. In a functional approach, it's based off of the chronic progression of what goes on with chronic illness. And the difference between acute disease and chronic illness, acute disease is something that's self-resolving. It's like a common cold. You'll get it. It'll last 7 to 10 days on average. It'll just reduce during that time, and you're going to be fine afterwards. With a chronic illness, it's not self-limiting. It doesn't self-resolve. It gets worse over time. Multiple organ systems are always involved. And by the time someone finally comes to you to try and figure out what's going on, whatever started the whole thing may not be there anymore. So it's a completely different understanding on how to do things. But with chronic illness, it's what really works. When we look at the traditional approach, it's based off of studies that are falsified in a huge way. And you compare that to a functional approach, you're looking at physiology, the way the body functions, the way it should function. And you look at research in light of how the body should function to see how it really lines up and put everything together as a whole package. In the traditional sense, you're looking at protocols, which is somebody else's guess that everybody just hangs on their patients. In a functional approach, it's all individually based care where you analyze everything, you test out what really makes people better, and you use that. So it's a completely different approach to the whole thing. So we start looking at some of the different beliefs that people have about Lyme disease. There's a bunch of myths about those. We'll only get through a couple of them. One is this is a tick-borne disease. That's absolutely not the case. There's a lot of studies that show that the larvae of mosquitoes can have Lyme bacteria in them. Those Lyme bacteria survive through the whole maturation process, and by the time that larva gets to an adult, that Lyme bacteria, Borrelia, is still alive and well, and it can go right into a host when the mosquito's getting its meal. So that's absolutely the case. You get up in the north, deer flies and other biting flies, they transfer it. We've had people come in with the deer fly in their hand that they swatted off their arm. They gave them the bullseye rash and started the Lyme disease. And they went to the emergency room. In the emergency room, they just laughed at them after working with them for a couple of weeks, and they were doing a lot better. They went back to urgent care, and the urgent care nurse said, well, if that's the case, you're only the fifth one this week. Down in the South Louisiana area, it's pretty commonly transferred through spiders. It can be transferred through food, especially uncooked meats like venison is pretty common. It's in 2 to 3% of the blood bank up in Minnesota and Wisconsin, transferred through blood transfusions. It's in both male and female sexual fluids. It can be transferred that way. Transfers through the placenta. It transfers through breast milk. What we need to really look at with Lyme disease, this is a fluid transfer disease. It's not a tick-borne disease. The tick transfers fluid from one host to the other, and if that fluid's infected with Lyme disease or the co-infections, the host is going to be exposed to it. Some of the other things that people think is that tick has to be attached for a long time. The research doesn't prove that out. This is the Lyme liaison from Harvard a few years back, Navin Zeus. She's talking about the attachment time to transfer different diseases, and as far as Lyme disease, they just don't have any idea. We do know that the larva of a tick typically will feed for 1 to 2 days max. The nymph is 3 to 5 days, and the adult can feed up to 7 or 8 days. So the time of exposure can be quite a bit different. They all can carry it, and they can all transfer it. If we start to look at the bugs that are involved, this is Borrelia right here. It's a corkscrew-shaped bacteria. These things are really amazing. They're only about 20 to 30% of the people get a rash. Most of the tests up until IGeneX just came out with a new one were all of the B31, the Bergdorfi strain, and that strain was isolated on ticks, not out of an infected person or animal. 50% of the tests are negative, and the Western blot, the best test that they have, it's only valid the first 6 to 8 weeks after infection. If we look at some of the aspects of Borrelia, the Lyme bacteria, it's a real close cousin to syphilis. In fact, the tick-borne diseases, the bugs that are transferring this, we've found a lot of people in the last few years that are doing syphilis diseases with Lyme disease. We've been finding a lot of transfer of what people commonly consider sexually transmitted diseases transfer through the ticks. Different parasitic issues like chlamydia, trichomonas, syphilis has been a lot more common in the last few years. The Borrelia bacteria, they mutate very quickly. In fact, if we look at what happens inside of a tick, as a tick is taking its blood meal, it changes the temperature inside the tick, it changes the pH, that warns the bacteria inside that a new host, potential host is there. Those bacteria, they line up, they start to read the proteins in the blood, they cover themselves, they copy those proteins in the blood, they cover themselves with those proteins, they differentiate into more like an attack squad of specialized forms, so that there's a multitude of forms that come into the body when everything's ready. And it's really a wild, concerted effort. They can move. They only use the circulatory system as a highway. They can move in and out of that very quickly. Whenever it's threatened, it makes a biofilm, and the biofilm is fixed. It stays there, it's floating, it moves. Typically, that's going to be in the circulatory system. That can cause strokes and heart attacks, things like that. It can communicate inside of those biofilms, and it can multiply inside of those also. Another thing that's really amazing with the Borrelia bacteria is it swims twice as fast as the fastest white blood cell we have, the macrophage, and so it can outswim it. They've actually taken movies of macrophages chasing these, and they can't keep up, and the Borrelia bacteria can just pierce through the blood vessel wall and be gone, and the macrophage doesn't know where it's at. So next one we look at is Bacsia. It's absolutely the #1 co-infection in many parts of the country. When I first looked at Lyme disease many years ago, there were about 100 strains of Borrelia. Last looking, there was over 300 strains, and you can't find out how many strains there are anymore because the government hides those. They're the labs that count them. You have to have somebody that has access that. That's typically somebody in a pathology lab. Tom Greer was one of the better resources for that, but he's been too sick to do that work. Bacsia, when I first looked, it was about 30 strains. Last I saw, it was over 100 strains. There's 3 lab tests and a blood smear. Those lab tests are less than 20% accurate in the first 1 to 2 weeks of infection. After that, no accuracy. This is an electron micrograph picture of of infected blood cells with Bacsia. Those little purple dots inside of the round blood cells, those are one-celled animal parasites called Bacsia. And they literally eat the inside of the blood cells out, causes red water disease in cattle. That makes the blood cells burst whenever they go through tight places like the kidneys. And the blood cells will burst as the blood goes through the kidneys, and the cattle literally bleed themselves to death through their bladder. Next one we look at is Erlichia. Erlichia is a bacterial parasite that invades our immune cells. This is a Erlichia bacteria inside of a neutrophil. And what that does is that disarms the immune system so it can't really attack anything and do its job. Last I saw this, 26 different strains of this, a couple of ELISA tests. Those tests were only accurate in the first 1 to 2 weeks of infection. Next one we look at is Rickettsia. Rickettsia is a little bit more common than Erlichia. Rickettsia is a bacterial infection that invades the epithelial cells. Those are the cells that line typically our blood cells or our blood vessels in the arteries, veins, capillaries, and also in the gut. So this will make the circulation get distorted, make the blood cells tumble, make them more likely to clot, and in the gut it'll infect the lining of the gut. We'll see that in a little bit. Is only one cell layer thick. It infects those, destroys gut integrity, destroys our absorption issues, and then you start to have a lot of problems. The Antlasmosis is it's actually a reaction to Rickettsia-like infections that causes granulomas, and you see this one cell in here. It just looks like purple sand inside of it. That's what a granuloma is. It creates granules inside of tissues, and that just makes them tough so they can't function very well. This one is one that had a lot more awareness quite a few years back, the AlphaGal issue. And how this one came about is a group of researchers that were looking at trying to make a paper on cancer, and they couldn't come up with anything. And while they were doing their research, a couple of the people in the research group came down to Lyme disease. They started doing some lab tests, and they did a skin prick test with meat extract, not a part of meat, but whole meat extract. So that's going to have blood cells in it, muscle cells in it, the juice from inside the muscles, the protein inside the muscles, and all that. And they got some skin reactions with those, with what's called the RAS test, so the skin prick test. So they said, oh, that's because of the sugar that's stored inside of the muscle cells, and they called that the AlphaGal allergy issue. They're claiming this as an IgE response. No one ever tested for an IgE response off of the proposed galactose sugar that they said this was all about. They just made it all up. They printed in the newspapers, got a lot of notoriety. You always put junk research in the newspapers, and this is one of those spin articles. They were popular for a couple of years, and it's just kind of faded off into the distance. Really wasn't all that valid. So we started looking at most people's approach to Lyme disease, and it's based off of the germ theory, which is Louis Pasteur. He spent his whole lifetime studying germs. He's the first one that came up with vaccinations that actually worked a lot different than what we see today. And he spent his whole life doing that, just thinking he was dedicating his life work to the benefit of mankind. But at the end of his work, he looked at one of his colleagues' works by the name of Bernard, and he looks at Bernard's work and goes, you know, Bernard was right. The microbe, what I've studied my whole life, it's really not what the issue is. The soil is the issue. What the constitution of the whole body is, what's going on inside the whole body determines whether somebody's going to get sick or not. when the constitution of the whole body is well and good, the immune system functions so well, people don't get sick. Something has to beat all that up, and that's what really is what's behind all the illness. And that's what we look at with a functional approach. So here's another eye-opening one, another quote from Navin Zeus, Harvard's Lyme liaison from a few years back, talking in Martha's Vineyard Hospital. She lets us know that the primary way that medicine treats Lyme disease is with doxycycline, and they'll alternate doxycycline and amoxicillin. It doesn't kill the Lyme bacteria. It only hopes to stop the bacteria from dividing, multiplying, and creating a big infection. It doesn't kill it. They leave that up to the immune system. But one of the big problems with that is this thing called biofilms. And as soon as you threaten the Lyme bacteria and the co-infections, they arrange themselves in geometric patterns to look very much like the weaving of a fabric. You'll get a bunch of them that line up parallel, more like my fingers, and then another layer will be close to 90 degrees to that, and another layer will be tangential to that, and they'll line up in groups like that, and then secrete this matrix that's very much like gelatin, and then that gelatin hardens. Antibiotics and immune cells cannot get inside of that matrix, that biofilm. But the Lyme bacteria, they can live in there up to 17 years. They can reproduce, they can feed, they excrete all their toxins. They do all their damage hidden inside of that. And this is one of the biggest issues why a lot of the treatments that are approached just really fail, is this one in conjunction with that. So now we start to look at the one that's the biggest predisposing factor and the biggest complication. Doesn't really matter what causes the change in the gut lining. This is always a huge issue with everybody with Lyme disease. The picture on the top is a normal lining of the gut. And those little fingers that stick up like this, those are called the microvilli. Those microvilli, they increase the surface area of the gut from a tube that's about 30 feet long in the average diameter of your finger, which wouldn't have much surface area at all, a few square feet, to the size of a tennis court. And the little cap you see over the top of those microvilli, that's a mucus coating that's entrapped some of the microbiota or the microflora in there. And it's the microbiota that does the bulk of our digestion. You see it inside the mucus lining in there. It pretty well coats these microvilli, and looking at that, it's apparent that the food can't really touch the microvilli. It's the microflora that goes up and does the nutrient exchange and brings it down into microvilli for all our nutrient exchange. So it's really important. And if we look down below, this is a result of chronic inflammatory responses. In this case, they're saying this is celiac, but celiac isn't the only thing that does this. Anything that creates a chronic inflammatory response inside of the gut does this. And you can see that the layer right underneath the microvilli in the lower picture has thickened. It's 4 or 5 times as thick as what it is in a healthy gut. And there's no microvilli for the flora to hide in, and you don't see that mucus cap over the top. This allows for the flora just to be wiped out, and when that happens, it allows the pathogenic things to be able to take root and grow however they want. So Rickettsia can do this, chronic stress can do this, food intolerances do this. One of the biggest factors that does this is Candida infections. And granted, it's extremely bad Candida infection right here. This person is not healthy, not likely they're going to live a whole bunch longer when an infection is this bad. That totally destroys all your digestive issues, absorption issues, and it's allowing the Candida to get into the bloodstream. It's going to overwhelm the liver, spill out through the rest of the body, and become systemic. One of the biggest problems with systemic Candida is that it can morph into cancer. So Candida can cause cancer. It can change the cells into cancer, and it's one of the primary ways the cancer patients actually dies from Candida infection, not from the cancer itself. So it's a really big issue when the gut gets in a place like this to be this bad. Antibiotics are another common thing that does this. Steroids are another common thing that does this. Hormonal replacement therapies do this, whether that's birth control or postmenopausal. Those can really set the gut up for this. This is looking at a fungal body. That picture of the colon right here, this is Candida. It actually has 4 forms: yeast, fungus, fungal parasite, and with a fungal parasite, mold follows very commonly. This is a fungal body right here. So that's what we're looking at in those plaques inside of the colon. And all those cottony white, seemingly benign, hairy looking things coming off the fungal body are called mycelia. Those are the feeding tubules. One of the biggest problems with the mycelia and the feeding tubules in a really bad fungal infection like this is they're impervious to the immune system. The immune system can't touch them. And it is the normal flora, the microbiota in the gut that's supposed to keep these in check. And this is the same case inside the nose, the ears, the mouth, reproductive tracts, more of a big issue inside of a woman's reproductive tract. And the flora in all of those areas of mucous membranes is virtually identical. Women's reproductive tract can be a little bit different in that the flora primarily feed off of her cervical mucus that has glycogen in it. Glycogen is a starch that our liver makes to store food, and that's released inside the cervical mucus that she has. That's one thing that feeds the flora and keeps that healthy in there. And the flora feeds off of that and makes acid, and that acid is one of her protections. It's the microflora that's in there, the acid pH, and the immune function that's in there. You change the cervical mucus from hormone replacement therapies, food issues, gut problems, all of that put together, she no longer makes the acid. She's real vulnerable, and that's when the yeast really grows. So yeast infections are an indication of a much bigger thing going on inside. Whenever we have anything like that going on, the gut actually, it starts to leak. And it will do that in progression. So if we look at this, all those cells in the arc that goes up, those are the 1 cell layer thick that lines the gut with a microvilli on top of those. And those cells are supposed to be really close and tight together, like we see in the lower left. It's tight junctions that hold those things together. And one of the bigger proteins that holds those tight junctions together is called zonulin. It works very much like Velcro, and that keeps it so that nothing can pass between the cells. That makes it so all absorption has to go through the cell, and that's how it's selective in what comes into our bloodstream. But as inflammatory responses start to go inside of the gut, that starts to open up those tight junctions, things start to leak through. The more it leaks through, the more inflammatory response that comes in there. It opens things up wider and wider, so you get things the size of a bus to basically drive through in the sense of what should happen in the gut. Whole proteins can get through, whole bacteria, yeast cells, fungal cells, different things of that nature. That'll start to create an autoimmune response going on in all the immune cells right underneath the lining of the gut, which half of our immune system is actually in the gut wall to protect us from the potential invaders that are going to come in through there. And once that starts to happen, there's an autoimmune response that starts to go against the cells that line the gut, called the epithelial cells there, and the autoimmune response will start to self-destruct those cells. So whenever that happens, the gut starts to leak in a really huge way, and whenever that happens, there's it just starts to really overwhelm the liver. The liver is placed strategically from a circulation standpoint next in line from the gut. So all the blood returning from the gut doesn't go back to the heart, it goes to the liver first. In the liver, you see this picture, all the purple vessels in there, those are all the blood vessels coming off the stomach, the colon, and the small intestine. That goes straight into the liver because the liver's got some really, really important jobs. It's supposed to catch and destroy pathogens and bacteria, parts of bacteria that come through also. Stores your food sources, stores carbohydrates as glycogen, stores oils and fats, it stores proteins. It's supposed to clear the body of toxins. One of the 4 organs that actually clears the body of toxins. And it does that in 2 phases. Phase 1 has 5 different paths to try and neutralize toxins, and typically will make free radicals in that phase. Phase 2 has 6 different pathways that makes those free radicals and more toxic byproducts of phase 1 water soluble so they can be excreted. The primary excretion route would be through the bowel and the bladder. And the liver also makes bile and assembles proteins. When the gut leaks, or whenever the medical approach to try and deal with the Candida overgrowth goes on in there, which they know follows the use of antibiotics. Whenever that happens, they commonly will follow that with antifungals. And one of the biggest problems with that is antifungals are really toxic to liver. And the more toxic the liver already is, which is already being bombarded with all the toxins coming from the leaky gut, the more toxic it is in the first place, the more injury it can do to the liver. And you can render a liver unable to do its job by adding something along like this. And the antifungals really don't clear the body of Candida anyway. It's not dealing with the issue of why it's there. And so if we look at another view of what the gut lining looks like from an electron micrograph, this looking at it from the top down into it rather than from the side, you see great big holes are blown into the gut wall. This is from a chronic inflammatory issue, and this is going to leak like a sieve. They're really not going to have any absorptive integrity whatsoever. When that happens, you start to get all kinds of super toxins getting into the bloodstream. One of those is LPS. This is parts of the cell walls of the gram-negative bacteria in the flora inside of the gut. And the LPS, it acts as a super antigen and actually starts to create autoimmune responses in all the tissues that it deposits itself in. So if we look at autoimmune reactions, it's not a disease, it's a reaction to toxicity. The body gets too toxic, the liver cannot deal with the whole toxic load. That starts to spill out into all of the different tissues. When the body can't excrete it, it gets stored into the fats. When the fats and the tissues become too toxic, the immune system starts to attack it. And if we look at the different organs that actually do detoxification, our gut absorbs through the same process of detoxification that phase 1 does inside the liver. So it's widely known that the denaturing of pharmaceuticals by the gut wall is what mandates the dosage to be way bigger, commonly 4 times or more bigger than what it would go if it was injected, because it gets filtered out through the process in the gut. The flora, the microbiota that lines the gut, it also does detoxification processes, and so does the lining in the colon. So we actually have 4 organs to do detoxification. Everybody's focused on the liver itself. It can't do it all. The body was designed to try and keep toxins in a closed loop from the liver to the gut, and what the gut can't detoxify, the liver does. What the liver can't detoxify, shoves it back into the gut, and it's supposed to keep it inside that closed loop. But when it gets overwhelmed, it spills outside of that loop, and then we start to see responses like this. The secondary elimination organs are the skin and the lungs. You start to see rashes like this on people with toxic responses. And by the way, anybody that's really looked at the keto issue, a fair amount of your big players that really promote that, this is a common look that the skin on their faces of them and their families look like. They're full of rashes because of the toxic responses going on, because the diet's really not that healthy. It's designed for a quick fix to drop a lot of weight quickly, but it's not for long term at all. It's not really healthy. The other secondary elimination organ is the lungs, and toxification is commonly what causes asthma that leads to the inhalers and all this. And it's a pretty common thing working with people with asthma. You can clear this up pretty quickly. Over the years, we've seen so many people able to just throw their inhalers away because we look at this research piece right here from the American Journal of Pathology, the autoimmune process. You can be arrested, it can be stopped if you fix what's going on inside of the gut. So it's just paramount to do that. And you can't fix the gut wall without fixing the flora. You can't fix the flora without fixing the gut wall, because the gut wall makes a mucus coating the flora hides in, and the flora does a large part of the digestion. There's no place for it to hide without the microvilli. So you've got to fix them both at the same time, and that approach isn't really dealt with very much. So another thing that typically happens is people start to lose their ability to make energy, and they get really exhausted, tired. Bedridden is pretty common. We had a 21-year-old farm kid a while back who came in with Lyme disease. But Bacsia was a lot bigger infection in him than the Lyme was, which that's not uncommon. We see that quite a bit. Anyway, he'd been doing what he could. It didn't work. He came in to see us. We figured out everything that he needed, and he wouldn't do it. He just didn't do it. He stayed in bed for 23 and a half hours a day, get up, get cleaned up, have something to eat, go back to bed. And went back and forth for a couple months, and he went back to a homeopath and got nowhere with that. Saw him later and figured out what he was doing, confronted him on it. He went home, he started doing what we gave him in the first place. He started healing. In a matter of a few weeks, he was starting to get outside and do things again. But this is really what beats up the energy cycles in a huge way. And this is a spillover of the toxic load that's going on with chronic illness. Lyme disease, you're getting it from the infective sides along with the complication side that's affecting the gut and co-infections and all that. So the way the hormones work is the hypothalamus is just above the brainstem, so it's just inside the head at the base. It reads all your circulating levels of hormones, gases, nutrients, minerals, things like that to regulate those. And with hormones, it communicates primarily with the pituitary gland. In its case, the pituitary gland communicates with the thyroid with TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And depending on how much TSH comes out, determines how much of the hormone the thyroid produces, called thyroxine. Thyroxine is inert. It doesn't have any biological activity. It needs converted in the peripheral tissues, mostly in the muscles, and that converts into T3 or T4. T4 converts to T3, T3 to T2, T2 to T1. Each one of those conversions can go normal process or reversed. The normal process is biologically active. The reverse process is biologically inactive. And we've had different ones where they go to the medical doctor and they say, oh, your thyroid tests are fine. They finally get a test that we talked about where you can measure the reverse and the regular T3 and T4 along with antibody issues against the thyroid. One person we had 200 times the reverse T3 that they had a free regular T3, and the free T3 doesn't differentiate between the two. Neither does the hypothalamus, for that matter. So at that, it was almost 200 times, and it was no wonder why they just didn't have any energy. They couldn't lose weight. So that's a pretty common thing. The thyroid, it controls our metabolic rate. It does that by controlling the size of mitochondria, which are the energy factories inside of the cells. And with that, it determines how big they are, how active they are, and how many there are. That determines how much energy each cell burns. That will determine our overall weight and our ability to lose weight. It's half of a woman's cycle, and thyroid problems are responsible for 60% of the miscarriages that happen out there. Here's a couple of research articles proving that the thyroid's overwhelmed with toxins, so I'm not making this up at all. Next, we look at the adrenal. It's our stress gland. It controls inflammation. It does that through cortisol pathways. With controlling inflammation, it's master gland over the immune response, because immune response is directed by inflammatory reactions. It controls stress blood sugars, and this is one of the biggest causes of diabetes. Right here is adrenal dysfunction. It makes the precursors for sexual hormones of both men and women. It controls the function of the kidneys and controls postural blood pressure. So people that rise up and they start to get lightheaded, that's usually because of adrenal insufficiency. The way you can tell if it's blood sugar will make the peripheral vision start to tunnel along with the head getting light. So the adrenal has all these different jobs, and it's regulated the same way that the thyroid is. The hypothalamus up on top, it reads the circulating levels of the hormones the adrenal puts out. It communicates with the pituitary gland to regulate the production and excretion of the hormones that the adrenal needs to do. So pregnenolone and DHEA, those are the building blocks for the sexual hormones. And whenever somebody is chronically ill, like with Lyme disease, that pathway of making hormones is pretty well bypassed because, first of all, pregnenolone DHA is going to get shunted away, but the conversion of the building blocks for making the sexual hormones typically happens in the peripheral tissues once we get older. Almost all of that is in women, half of that's in men. Whenever somebody is going through chronic illness, you get the same shift as if you've gone through menopause, and it shifts into the peripheral tissues. You start to see genital atrophy, genital dysfunction, erectile dysfunction is a huge issue in women, probably more so than men. It's just ignored because they can still engage, but they have hard times with orgasms because their clitoris won't engorge because of depleted hormones, and that makes it unable for erection to happen in all of that. This is part of the way that happens. It's called the pregnenolone steal. Normally, the adrenal gland should make a balance of cortisol to control inflammation, and under chronic stress, the need for cortisol, it rises quite a bit. When that happens, it takes the building blocks of pregnenolone and DHEA and converts those over to cortisol. So it doesn't give the gonads, the ovaries and the testes, the precursors they need to build the sexual hormones. And you start to see really decreased libido with this, along with genital atrophy and erectile dysfunction that goes on. This is a pretty big issue. You can bring this back fairly well if you address this right. Another thing that happens with the chronic stress is there's about 27 different hormones in fat tissue. One of those is aromatase. And aromatase is stimulated by increased cortisol. Whenever cortisol rises, it makes the muscles release amino acids. Those amino acids go in the bloodstream, come back to the liver, get converted into sugar. As the sugar rises, that sugar is rising for us to be able to defend our lives. As the sugar rises and it's not getting used up, the pancreas pumps out a ton of insulin to get it into the tissues because it's dangerous if the sugar is very high. Creates all kinds of destructive issues in every tissue. The eyes is one of the big ones, where they came up with a measurement of 120 for measuring diabetes. But anyway, in the presence of cortisol and insulin, it turns aromatase on. Aromatase takes men's circulating testosterone, converts it into toxic estrogen, takes women's estrogens, turns them into toxic estrogen and testosterone. So there's another aspect that with the chronic illness that really messes up with the hormones. And once you start to get the hormones messed up, you really start to mess with women in a huge way. Picosa, polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's commonly promoted this response of insulin resistance, but with the insulin resistance, you're also changing your thyroid hormone. Typically, there's a problem with thyroid hormones as a part of PCOS and the other reproductive problems that go on with women. As the thyroid hormone is literally half of her cycle, and when it's in balance with estrogens, they're in pretty good harmony, but they'll play king of the hill if one gets on top of the other, and it's usually the thyroid that gets beat up first, and the estrogens will really try and depress that. When that happens, it creates these more cystic types of responses inside the ovaries. That's a normal process of ovulation, creating cysts, but they're more tough, they're more fibrous, they don't break like they should with ovulation, and that creates multiple cysts in there, and that's where your polycystic ovarian syndrome is. It's a combination of adrenal dysfunction, thyroid dysfunction, blood sugar issues, insulin resistance. It's the whole thing all put together. The flora inside the gut also makes a significant amount of neurotransmitters. There's every indication with research that it makes every neurotransmitter we have, which makes our brain and our nervous system work. It also has all the evidence that it makes every single hormone that we make. And it's not that it makes all of our hormones and all of our neurotransmitters. It makes every kind. It's made in different tissues. The hormones are made in different tissues. The gut microbiota is one of those. And when you start to have, because of all the complication issues, overgrowth of yeast, the Candida, in all of its four forms, it starts to put out a toxin called acetylaldehyde. Acetylaldehyde is 5 to 7 times stronger than embalming fluid, formaldehyde, and it creates a huge toxic response inside the body. In the dopamine-making nerve cells, acetylaldehyde will combine with the dopamine to create a super toxic concoction called salicylanol, and it kills the nerves that make the dopamine. Dopamines are a feel-good hormone. So if you kill the nerves that make dopamine, you can't feel good. This is another part of the reason why people are so beat up with everything. So there's also a huge response in the brain with food. This says food allergies, but food intolerance is more accurate. A lot of research that shows there's changes in circulation within the brain. Wheat is a big one with that. It changes circulation. It can also create psychological disorders. Just food intolerances. It's a really big one. The lab testing for food intolerances is only about 2 to 3% accurate. Something we do a lot with. We do it with a really high degree of accuracy, and these are really critical to know what these are to be able to go forward to do healing. When you look at all of the evaluative things that we do in an evaluation, as I said earlier, you're talking over $9,000 worth of lab tests just to do things, and that's not even checking out the function of everything and implementing a treatment plan. And typically we can get people healthy for our cost less than that. So it's a lot more cost effective working with us, and we're a lot more functional because we get things done a lot faster than most people are used to also. So when you start to look at all the symptoms of Lyme disease, the reality is most of these arise from complications. And the complications are the same thing that are the predisposing factors that make people get too sick. The biggest complication is toxic overflow. Lyme bacteria, they make ammonia, the Rickettsia inside of the gut. It's going to make the gut leak. That's going to give you LPS, ammonia. Along with that, acetylaldehyde is going to grow up because it's going to beat up the flora. Candida is going to grow. You have all this vicious cycle going on when you have a chronic illness in that way. And with the rising level of toxicity, there's impaired detoxification pathways. The liver gets too overwhelmed to do it. The gut lining has lost its integrity and its surface, so it doesn't have the surface area to do it or the integrity to do it. It leaks like a sieve. All that ends up spilling out throughout the rest of the body. That creates autoimmune responses other places. Along with the toxicity, your hormonal system is turning upside down. It's overwhelming your immune system. Your immune system is not a good detoxifier. It's not the way it was functioning. It's not the way it's designed to function. So along with the toxicity and ability to detox, you have the changing flora inside of the gut and the gut leaking, and you have this whole snowball of things where a large percentage of the symptoms going on with Lyme disease are from these. And this is part of the reason why there's not really a magic bullet to be able to address these things. So we started looking at different ways to approach things. There's a lot of research out there. I had to cut all the slides out because there were too much graphics in them and it's too big to load up on a webinar here. If I do this in multiple segments, we cover a lot more. But, you know, there's a lot of research out there that shows different combinations of herbs are as effective as your strong antibiotics, but instead of injuring the organs that the bacteria and the bugs that they're going after, the antibiotics will destroy. The herbs actually bring health to those. So you're doing a whole bunch of things. You really need a concerted effort to bring all of the body systems back up to functioning properly, along with addressing the infective part also. And you don't want to. A butcher said this about butchering many years ago that really applies to approaching Lyme disease. He says of the things that he would have to slaughter to butcher, he said, you don't want to kill them. You just want to let them die. And he wasn't saying that in a sadistic way to torture animals and birds that he was preparing for people. He was making a statement understanding physiology very well. When you traumatize something, it instantly releases all these incredible hormones, all your adrenaline hormones. They ruin meat. They totally ruin it. When you threaten Lyme bacteria and all the co-infections, they mutate very quickly. They make biofilms very quickly within a couple of hours, and they'll insulate themselves off from whatever it is that you are aggressively trying to go after. A lot of the biofilm busters that are out there, they're really toxic. People can't handle them. They're a major threat like an antibiotic, and they close things off, and they just don't do as well as what people promote. You need to figure out ways to sneak in to the biofilms that isn't this great huge alarm, but sneak in there and not alarm the bacteria that are there, so you can allow the body to overcome them and get rid of them. And you can do that pretty darn quickly. It's easier to get rid of Lyme disease than the complications by a long shot. It's not uncommon. We had somebody just a little while ago, they had a tick on them for 2 or 3 days. They thought it was another pain and were just ignoring it. Finally found it, and we checked out the tick. We do that also. We can tell whether your tick is infected or not. So we did that. It's somebody we were working with distantly. We checked it out. It had Borrelia, the Lyme bacteria, I think 2 strains. There are 2 strains of Bacsia, 1 strain of Erlichia, 1 strain of Rickettsia. And we started working with them. The Lyme was almost gone in a matter of 3 weeks. By 4 weeks, I believe, the Lyme, Erlichia, and Rickettsia, they were all gone. It was right around 3 or 4 weeks. And the Bacsia had the strongest strain that we found, divergence. That can take quite a bit longer. But I think that whole thing was done in like 6 weeks. It was less than 8. And if we catch something early, we can do that. It's when they're chronic, we still are getting over 95% of those people healthy again. And the 5% is people just don't follow instructions. If you follow what we do, we pretty well get people healthy all the time at a fraction of what you're going to pay other places, and a lot quicker. So, this is a really important research article here. There's a 20-to-1 return on investment with doing a nutritional approach on everything. This is from 5 Nobel Prize laureates who did some research, and it was published in the World Health Organization. And they figure that through quality of life and the ability to contribute to society, productivity, and all that, there's no investment that comes close to that at all. One thing that's really important to know and to state here is the quality of vitamins is all over the map. And I can't put everything in here, but the Attorney General of New York did a raid on Walgreens, Walmart, Target, and GNC several years back, and they found that 80% of the supplements they pulled off the shelf did not have any trace of what they said on the label. Those are some pretty big suppliers right there. The quality of vitamins is really all over the map. We only use really high quality stuff, and over 30 years we know what that is, but the present health crisis is restricting supply of even the best companies in the world out there of their raw materials, and it's changing the industry. We just found another supplement from a company that we thought was reputable. They just changed the formula, didn't announce it, didn't let anybody know we found it, because we had things going wrong with people. We were the only ones that found it out of who knows how many tens of thousands of dogs. And so then we're in a scramble to find something to replace it, which that's been happening a lot lately. When you look at fish oils, 75% of the fish oils are rancid before you buy them. If it's not refrigerated, don't do it. They're no good. Probiotics are worse than that. The best companies that we have in North America, some of those companies have close to 20 different products on flora, and maybe one of them might work. So, the flora is I don't even know if it's 5% that's out there that's good. And the way we know is we test everybody on everything to see what their response is. This isn't because I have a love affair with any company. We have products from a multitude of companies because one company will have something way better than another. We know we have the absolute best multivitamin you can get in North America. We have the best fish oil you can get in North America. We used to have the best calcium, but they changed their formula, and we're finding adequate replacements, but not one that you can say everybody can take this. You've got to test them. So it's frustrating on our side. It's frustrating on your side also. But the point is, you can't take inferior vitamins and get the responses that clinicians are getting with high quality stuff. A lot of clinicians don't have good quality stuff either. So here's some real keys for you to take home on things you can do right now. One of the biggest issues on detox that really isn't talked about is elimination. Normal elimination for bowel habits 3 to 5 times a day. Our record was once every 5 to 6 weeks, and the record before that was once every 2 or 3 weeks. Both those people got giddy when they started going 3 times a day. Their life just totally changed. We have another one recently that's 3 times a month. Normal transit time of food should be 12 to 18 hours, really in the 14 to 18 hour range. If it's slower than that, you're toxic. Just plain, flat, and simple. The flora in the colon is what determines whether you can excrete your toxins or resorb them. If you have something longer than that, the period of time it should be in the colon, you're going to resorb it and recycle it. And that's going to be a big, big, big part of the problem of why you're not being well. So it doesn't matter what your normal is. Across the world, the people who have healthy guts that don't have any kind of gut disease, 3 to 5 times is normal. It doesn't matter what culture you're talking about. Bladder emptying, females have to go at least 8 times a day, males at least 5. So that's flushing the water half your weight in ounces daily is absolutely critical. The way you regulate bowel habits is not through Metamucil. That will create food intolerance issues, inflammatory issues, and you'll lose all your microvilli and create a pathological case inside your gut. It's one of the worst ways to do it. You do that with vegetables. Starchy vegetables is the best way to do it. And the coffee enemas, they're pretty brutal. We test people on those, and it's rare to find somebody that can even handle those for 30 days. Green tea is a lot better. Make sure it's organic. Salada makes a really good decaf green tea. Most people that need the enemas for detox purposes, their adrenals will burn out. Caffeine will fry your adrenals if they're already burned out. Got a couple sites of some really good products here. The Multi, that one's right. It's the best one you can get, and we're the cheapest people out there on that if you go through our store. Actually, if you go through our office, it's cheaper than that. This is the best fish oil you can get. Below that calcium, we got to replace that with 2 or 3 others. So don't get that one. The D3 5000, that's a really, really high quality one. And that C is a pretty good one, but I'm going to replace that with a different one also on the product page real soon. Really healthy thing to do. 50% of every plate of food should be vegetables. Should have 5 colors of vegetables a day. And that way you're going to get a good range of antioxidants and other things to keep you really healthy. Herbs are medicine for basically everything. They enhance the flavor of food. They're extremely healthy. The only herb to really stay away from, as a general rule, is black pepper. It creates inflammatory responses in your gut, and if you're already ripped up, you can't handle that. Here's 3 things to avoid as far as foods go, and these are universal. Corn is full of atrazine and glyphosate. That's Roundup. So anything that has corn in it, a lot of your gluten-free flours and products are full of corn and or potato. Potatoes are pretty toxic too. So gluten-free stuff, you got to read the label to see what's there. If it's got any corn products in there, that's going to be an issue. Xylitol is a corn product. A lot of vitamin C is corn products also. No dairy feeds off of corn, so all your dairy is going to be out. Commercial meats, like the feedlots, those are all fed off of corn. You're better off to buy that from the local farmer. Wheat is sprayed with Roundup glyphosate just before harvest. 95% of the hard wheat crop in America is sprayed with Roundup just before harvest, so it's toxic. And that's one of the big things with the GMO in both the corn and the wheat is all the herbicides, the pesticides they have to spray to keep it going, which, by the way, good farmers feed the soil, bad farmers feed the plant, and we have very few that are feeding the soil. Best place to really get your vegetables is farmers markets. There you can talk to people, you can find out how they take care of things, and it's a good place to find out where you can get good clean meats too. They might not sell it at your local farmers market, but they'll know who does. We've been doing a farmers market out our way, and there's 2 people selling meats. They both do a stellar job with production. And I know another one that does a good job too. And sugar's the last one. Sugar feeds everything that's pathological. You got to cut your sweet tooth. Just no way around it. It feeds everything you don't want. It feeds Candida, feeds every pathogen you have. It feeds cancer, feeds autoimmune issues. It destroys the gut lining. It's not good at all. We've got to get rid of our love affair with sweets if we really want to heal. So if anybody is looking for some help with this, here's a good way to do it. We do consultations. Fee for those is typically $100. There's 3 forms we need filled out, and we need them filled out in detail. Because I don't want to talk about me, and we don't talk about general things. We talk about you. And as we started out doing a consultation, we highlighted enough things in somebody's case that been going on for well over a decade, seen a bunch of doctors, been sick for most of their life. We highlighted enough in there where they implemented those without even doing an evaluation. they implemented those that are already doing significantly better. That's why I asked for the questions. We need that information in those forms. Also need 3 pictures, one whole body from the front, one whole body from the side, and one in the face. Those tell us a lot about hormone functions, toxicity issues, tell us a lot of things about health. And it's nice to see who you're working with also. Email those back to us with the instructions on that consult page. And as soon as we get everything, we'll set up a time and do a consult. We'll go over your case. And most people know that for most people's experience, they learn more in one of our consultations than they do in working with multiple docs over a decade or more. We really get into what's going on with your case. So I invite you to do that. I hope you found this very informative and very helpful. I gave you a lot of practical things and a lot of understanding. Remember, you go somewhere else, you're going to be paying a huge chunk on lab tests that really aren't going to be that valuable. We do all that in-house, and we can save you a lot of money. Most of the care we do is at a distance. We work with people all over the country. So consider that one, and we'll talk to you then if you follow through. Thanks for attending. I appreciate all your time.